impact your life. And here it is, guys. Go along with me on this. What does it mean to be relevant? What does it mean to be relevant? I just came back 2 weeks ago from an incredible conference at Oral Roberts University. And while I was there, from last week I shared a little bit of this with you guys. I want to share it with you a little bit more. What does it mean to connect with God? What does it mean? Because listen, if we're not relevant to God, there's no point in being relevant to the culture. We've got to be relevant with God first and foremost, and always relevant with what God is saying. But how do we become that? We become that by understanding the language that God speaks. And I love it because when I heard this message, Mark Rutland, who's so amazing at the things that he talked about what language does God speak? What language does God speak? And he makes a great point. God does not speak in King James English. He doesn't. I mean, I know that we read in King James English, but he doesn't say, "Thou must listen to me from thy earth." God's not speaking in King James English. Not only that, God is not speaking necessarily in this language or that language or whatever. You know what language God speaks? God speaks God. And we translate it into our languages. God speaks God. And we translate what God says into our languages. So the key is to hear in the heart what the Lord is saying. We must be relevant to what God is saying. Because what God is saying will always be relevant to our lives. The question is, will we be in a position for it to be relevant? Are we really wanting to hear what God has to say? Are we willing to hear in a way that we don't normally hear? That we can open up our hearts and literally say, "God, I want to hear from you. I want to hear the way you speak, and I'm not afraid to listen in that way." And once we become relevant to God, now here's the tricky part, we have to also be relevant to the culture that is around us. And the culture that is around us does not necessarily speak the same language. I've learned to speak Colorado. I've noticed something about Coloradans that I'm just now noticing. That Coloradans have a lot of joy. I'm not a Coloradan. I'm from Florida, and it's almost like being from South Georgia because it's so southern in our approach and the way that we do things. We're still very southern culture. But I came here, I noticed Coloradans are kind of happy, you know. They got a smile, and they almost laugh when they say things to you, you know. They're almost laughing, and they got a jolliness about them, you know. And I've had to learn how to speak Coloradan. I've had to learn to come up and say, "Hey, man, how you doing?" You know, have a little bit of laugh to you when you speak Coloradan. And that's the thing, though. I can speak Southern culture, and they'll look at me, and I'll say, "Listen, we're fixing to go over yonder." They'll look at me and say, "What are you talking about? We're fixing to go over yonder." I have to learn how to speak the language that the culture is speaking. Now here's the real important part. Here's what we do when it comes to giving a word from God and understanding the word. We have to be able to speak God's language, which He speaks to our heart. We have to hear from God and obey what He's telling us. And then we have to translate what God is saying into the culture that surrounds us. That's what we've got to be able to do in order to see the word advance. That's how the kingdom is coming forth. Because they're not sitting there, listen, culture around us is not sitting around knowing how to hear from God. They don't. It was hard for the disciples. I mean, they were cutting off people's ears and stuff, man. Jumping out of boats and all kinds of crazy stuff. They didn't necessarily know how to hear from God. They would miss it so much. Now listen, if they miss it, what makes us think that the culture around us is going to totally get it? Our job is to know how to hear from God. It is imperative. Jesus Christ said, "My sheep know my voice." And the way you hear Him is by opening your heart more than your ears. Open your heart to hear Him, to hear what He's saying. Get in the quiet, still, small place. Get in a quiet place where you can pray and God will speak to you. I meant to say this, in a still, small voice that speaks directly to your heart. That's why I'm challenging you this week to get into the prayer closet so that you can hear from God. And when He speaks to you, when He speaks to me, then we've got to know how to bring it to the culture that's around us. That's what's important. And that we touch the culture that's around us. Thank you. All right. Last